Good morning, everyone, and thanks for tuning in. I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I hope you'll enjoy my presentation this way. So I hope that most of you listening are a little familiar with your work, perhaps through my field guide or my work in Africa, because what I would like to share with you today is the story of how I came to do what I've become known for my popularization of dragonflies. And the reason why I'm doing this now is because this year is an unusual year, but rather a special year for me, because this year I celebrate what I regard as my silver jubilee, my 25th anniversary of studying dragonflies. Now, the moment that I see as the moment that my interest really took flight was a bit over 25 years ago today. And this was back at a time that I didn't actually know that much about dragonflies and wasn't too serious about them. And together with two of my friends, and we were all members of a Dutch youth society for natural history, I was on my way to actually attend a camp devoted entirely to dragonflies. And we had taken the last train that we could take there. It was already late. It was dark. But we didn't actually make it because lightning struck in the railway line. So we were actually forced to stay in another town than we had decided, and when the next morning we were able to continue, it didn't really make that much sense to go to the camp, and we might as well start exploring the surroundings and looking for dragonflies instead. And it just so happens that this was organized in the best dragonfly area of the country, and none of us really knew that much about dragonflies, and I definitely knew the least. So this was a very amazing day to begin with, because lots of species were new to us. Many of them were locally very rare. So when towards the end of the day we saw yet another strange, spectacular dragonfly, it didn't really surprise us that much. It was big, it was brown, it had this blue saddle, and we wondered what it might be. The dragonfly started to fight with another dragonfly, and then, completely to our surprise, landed at my feet. So I was able to catch it. And then we took our key and we followed through the key and discovered that it was a Vagrant Emperor, and that was rare, and that seemed exciting enough, but not so surprising because everything had been special to us that day. So we took photographs and we let it go again. And then finally we cycled to the campsite and met our friends, and were completely surprised to hear that actually we had just discovered a new species of dragonfly for the Netherlands, the 70th species on the national list. And so, yeah, it hardly seems more appropriate that that was sort of the moment that, yeah, as I said before, my interest really took flight. Now, I had been interested in natural history for a while. In this photograph, you see almost the moment that happened, where I'm holding a little tortoise when I was 9 years old. And on the right, you see one of the first drawings that I did. And the point living in Egypt was that I had very little information about the wildlife that I saw around me. For example, my field guide was to European birds, and I could obviously see that I was missing information and that even some of the species were different. So on my 10th birthday, I even decided, well, I'll just have to write my own field guide. And if you see the introduction here, it reads as follows. Today, the 7th of January 1985, I turned 10 and started this book. I've been interested in birds for about half a year, and in my many travels through Egypt, I have seen more than 36 species. And my sister was even so kind to draw a portrait of me to go with the introduction. And I started to take that whole documentation of the species I saw around me very seriously. Here, for example, you see some color plates that I painted of the birds that I saw when I went out bird watching after school in the parks in Cairo. And my artwork became more and more elaborate as I became more familiar with the species I saw. And this is what my work would look like. I would take notes, for example, here I saw some colorful fish swimming around in the water of the Nile, and then at home I made a more elaborate study of those. Here you see another example of a caterpillar that I found and that I reared, and you see I illustrated its life cycle, and I also wrote an entire report about it, and you'll see that I call it the olive green hawk moth, Eruptia olivertum, which obviously is not actually the correct name. The problem is I didn't actually have those names, so I had to come up with something myself. To take dragonflies, for example, I did notice dragonflies as a 12-year-old, but all I had about dragonflies was just this page in the animal encyclopedia that I owned. So, and again, I could see that I was seeing more species and I was seeing different species. And luckily, my father had a Latin dictionary, and I gathered that these names had two parts and that the species were placed in different genera. So I would take a genus from my encyclopedia, and then I would give it my own little description and my own name. So here you see some notes, probably the first notes I took of dragonflies, and on the left you also see some of the descriptions I made. So for example, I found something that seemed to be similar to a Sempitrum, and it was red, so I called it Sempitrum flammarius. And then there was another one which had the color of grass. It was brown, so I called it Sempitrum gramina. And only much later did I realize that these were actually broad scarlets, and that I had made the classic taxonomic mistake of describing the male and the female of the same species as different species. One of the dragonflies that I described, and this was actually the first dragonfly that I found that was so different from what I'd seen before, that I decided I actually had to describe a separate genus for it. And this was one I found after having gone to church with my parents at All Saints Cathedral. It was hanging there in a bush in a garden, and it was very hairy, so I called it Frizzy Thorax, and I named it Toto Santa after the cathedral, All Saints Cathedral, that we attended. And many years later, reading that description and sort of looking at the mental image of it that I have in my mind, I realized that that actually was an encounter with the same species, the same Vagrant Emperor, that 8 years later I would discover as a new species for the country. So as I said, from that moment my interest really took flight, and it was this time when I was 20 years old that I discovered that new species for the Netherlands, that also with one of these two friends I went to Uganda as part of my master's to study butterflies. And there in the rainforest we found ourselves in a very similar situation as I had been in when I was when I was as a child in Egypt. So we were seeing all these different dragonflies, and we knew they were different species, but we had almost no information about them. So I kept this little self-made field guide where whenever we found a different species, I took elaborate notes and noted some differences, and we also gave them our own names. In this case, we gave them Dutch names, and all the identifications that you see there underlined were only added much later when I actually figured out what they were. And in our quest for information, we had been looking around desperately in the library of this little field station that we were in, and there obviously were no books for identifying dragonflies. But then we noticed at the bottom of a cupboard a piece of paper sticking out, and we pulled it out and we unrolled it, and it turned out to be this poster of the common dragonflies of the Durban area. And although we were of course thousands of kilometers away from Durban, we were in the right continent, and a lot of the species were actually there as well, and certainly a lot of the genera. So this really helped us along. And another thing that helped us along was actually a letter from Peter Miller, because someone informed us that there was a man who had actually worked on dragonflies in Uganda. And so we sent him a letter and we got a very nice and supportive reply. So when we were very sad to discover that when we returned from Uganda with quite a list of species that Peter had actually passed away, and we were never able to learn from him further and share any of our discoveries with him. And the rest, as they say, is history. I became very involved in dragonflies then. I became a part of the team that was writing up the atlas of Dutch dragonflies. And you can see here when I started each project and how long it took to finish them all. And I'm not going to discuss them so much in detail and talk about the particulars of those projects, but rather I would like to share sort of the philosophy that that was behind these projects and with the kind of thinking that I undertook them. The most substantial work that I've done in making dragonflies more accessible has, of course, been the work in Africa, and it's been quite a task. There are more than 700 species of dragonflies in tropical Africa, about 200 in Madagascar, so easily 1,000 of them in Madagascar and Africa combined. And to make them accessible, we now have information of all the species online. We have done red list assessments for all the species. We've done field work all over Africa. You can see with white dots all the records that we have, and with the black dots all the areas where I've done field work myself. We now have genetic data for lots of the species. We have field photographs for a lot of the species. I described as many as 80 new species new to science. So a lot of that basic work had to be done, had to be completed before anything else could actually be done with dragonflies, such as applying them in conservation and simply identifying them to be able to enjoy them like most of us do. And this was a mentality that I took very much from that youth society that I was a member of, and that was running a dragonfly mapping scheme at the time. And the idea of the scheme, the official reason, the official purpose of the scheme was to improve conservation of a threatened dragonfly, of a threatened insect, of these dragonflies. But what the society, of course, really was trying to do was to unite young naturalists with a shared cause. And so rather than emphasize how important conservation it was actually much more about the joy of discovery, of the beauty of nature, of being out together, the thrill of competition, and of course the pride of completion. And it's, as I said, very much that mentality that I took with me to Africa. And another aspect that became quite clear there is that natural history is not actually as perhaps so much about the nature and about the species that one studies, but very much about the people that are the naturalists. So the people that you are trying to involve and that you try to enlighten. That is actually your real subject. And to just give you an example, this is 2 years ago, and a friend of mine invited me to come to the annual Twitchers weekend on the island of Texel. He was the chairman of the Dutch Twitchers Society at the time, and he said that I could just come along and for free if I wanted, provided I would bring a presentation with me to give. Because he said there was a chance that there might be some cancellation in the program, and he just wanted to have a backup. And lo and behold, that Friday evening, there was indeed a vacancy and they needed someone to give a presentation. So there I was. And initially the Twitchers grumbled a little bit. Why would they have to listen to a talk about dragonflies? They were not interested in dragonflies. They were interested in birds. That's what they wanted to hear about. But as I started to talk about my discoveries in Africa and about describing new species and all of this discovery, they realized, of course, that what I was doing was happening with very much the same interest and the same mentality as what they were. Now the next morning, it was a beautiful day, but there was a very strong southerly gale, and there was no migration at all. And actually the island was quite empty, and the birders were despondently trying to find rarities, but they couldn't actually find any. Then all of a sudden came this report that this rare dragonfly had been found in the northern tip of the island, and everyone flocked together to see it. And it was actually a vagrant emperor. So then if you go to the websites and see what people have recorded, actually 150 people recorded that single vagrant emperor that day. And here you see some of their photographs. And you could hear them say, well, I'm not actually interested in dragonflies, but this is apparently a rare one, and it's better to have seen it. And you can imagine on that day that, even though their horizon had not been stretched to this particular point, that this chance incident and this accessible and this very attractive species convinced them that there was another fascination here to be had. And that, of course, is the idea behind the field guide and the idea behind the product that I'm most known for and that I'm also proudest of, and that is the field guide. I did for Europe, and of which tens of thousands of copies have been sold in 5 languages. Now, this is something that I really owe Graham Vick for. He was the one who introduced me to the publishers and to Richard Lewington. And yeah, something that really, almost by chance, sort of established me as this expert. And I'm very proud of this idea that, during summer days, there are tens of thousands of people out with my guide and having a better and more interesting day because of it. So I'm also very happy to say that last month, finally, the 2nd edition came out of this field guide. Actually, it took more years to finish the 2nd edition than it did to write the first. Times have changed. A lot has happened. So 14 years of change have been incorporated in the book. All the maps have been renewed. All the photographs have been renewed. The text has largely been revised. There's a new cover. I wrote a new preface myself. And we also added 6 species. Some of these species are vagrants, African species that have wandered into Europe, such as the keel glider that you see at the bottom, which was recorded on a small island in the Mediterranean. Other species were entirely new to science. A couple of years ago, this new species of pincertail that was discovered in Morocco. And I'm especially proud that we were also able to insert a new species of pincertail that was described only this year from Spain, and that was a very spectacular discovery and something that I only heard via a rumor that there was something going on there. The book was already finished, the layout was already done, it was about to go to print, and then I heard this rumor, and we were just able to actually insert this species. Which is good, because this is the first new species to be described from southwestern Europe since the 19th century. I'm also happy to announce that a book on the dragonflies of Madagascar is finally coming out. You'll see some familiar faces here. You'll see Mike, you'll see Alan, you see Pam, you see Sue and Dave. And they were part of an expedition that we held, or a tour, if you want, to Madagascar in almost 4 years ago now. And this was organized with the very purpose of collecting a little bit of money, and especially to collect photographs so that I could actually write this field guide. Because the dragonfly fauna of Madagascar is absolutely spectacular, and yeah, it is really something worth sharing. Madagascar even has 2 endemic families of damselflies, 2 families thus that are found nowhere else in the world, although actually at the time we did not even know that they were unique families, because we were still doing the research and the genetic work, especially to establish and to discover that actually they don't have any closer relationships anywhere. But of course, all of this talk still leaves unanswered, why it had to be me, why dragonflies, why me, and why in this kind of form? What kind of crazy guy does it take to do that? And I think the easiest way for me to look at that is to mirror myself in my father, who very sadly passed away earlier this year. And if you looked at at him and at me on paper, you'd think we were very different. My father was a theologian. He studied ancient texts, deciphering the alphabets and the words and the stories. He was an archaeologist, a historian, a poet. And you think that's very different from the type of scientist, a biologist that I am. But actually, I don't see it that way, because natural history and taxonomy isn't a science like most of the natural sciences, which are very exact, which are very much about reducing reality into numbers and to have control and to have power over reality and over those numbers. Whereas natural history is much more about communication. It's much more, as I said before, about the naturalist. It's much more about finding the right format and the right language to open up the living world to other people. And in that sense, it's actually not that far off from theology, where it is also very much that through language and through culture, you're actually trying to make humanity aware of certain greater truths. So you could say very much that natural history and taxonomy are not just natural sciences and not just humanities. They're actually in both schools of thought. And that is the kind of idea that I wanted to get across also in the new preface that I wrote for the field guide. And something I often say is that I identify with field guides. And what I mean by that is that on the one hand, I identify with field guides, I identify species with field guides, but I also actually identify with that concept of a field guide as an individual. And what I write in my preface is that, when I was 9 and when I got my first bird book, that planted this powerful idea in my mind that every species had an essence that I could name and imagine and retell. That every species, in a way, just like every human being, has an identity. And that identity is something that it instills sense in us. It instills a sense of the living whole that we belong to. It instills a sense of place. And by observing closely, of course, it also instills a sense of how, that multiverse, that universe of all these different species can change. And so an example of a project in which I sort of tried to attempt that, on the one hand, I was trying to open up the living world to people, but on the other hand, I was trying to give a meaningful narrative to that. An example of that is a project that was completed 5 years ago, in which, together with 2 colleagues, we described 60 new species at once of dragonfly from Africa, and that added 1 new species to every 12 that was known. And so we piled up this whole bunch of new species, and we just said, let's just sort of publish them all at once so that we can actually have a bit of a splash and actually share all these messages that we have. And very much, we focus on the side of taxonomy where we're talking about defining the species, about the science. But of course, at the same time, we're also giving them a name, which is a purely human act. And it is actually that aspect that excites human beings the most, and that also got most attention. So for example, this species was named after a Pink Floyd album, which is completely irrelevant to the dragonfly. But what had happened in this case is that years ago I'd been in the field with a friend, and the genus Amma, of course, already existed. And he said, well, if you ever find a new species of Amma, you should surely name it Amagama, after this classic Pink Floyd album. And that, when I did find a new species of Amma, is exactly what I did. And that it's something peculiar. It's something that people picked up on. And there are, of course, so many more stories and symbols and metaphors that you can link to a species like that. And for example, too often Africa, of course, is equated with famine and with war. And often, sadly, that is the case. And to take an example here, we see a river with a bridge in the distance. And this is a place that was actually on the front lines during the civil war in Sierra Leone. And villagers had been trapped on troops on both sides of the river, and not knowing where to go, they had jumped off this bridge and drowned in the river. And I was there doing field work 20 years later, and it was such a beautiful and peaceful place. And so when I discovered this new species, it just seemed most appropriate to name it after peace. And quite sadly, only a few years later, this exact area was in the news again, being in the epicenter of the Ebola outbreak that was ravaging West Africa. But of course, the most important message is that message about fresh water, which we always tie to dragonflies, and the importance of freshwater life. And of course, many of these species are very sensitive, are very rare, and it's possible to combine that message in a name that, you know, it's beautiful, but it's also precious, such as here the nugget sprite and the goldsmith threadtail. And another point that actually was important to make was also the aspect of human learning and of individual experience, and that with all the tools, all the modern tools of science and all the labs and all the computers, that they're redundant if you don't actually spend time in the field observing and really attuning yourself to the small differences, because you can do all the sequencing and all the analysis that you want, but if you don't actually learn to observe, you're not actually going to find these new species. So that was yet another message that we wanted to convey. But going back to the previous point, I think the main point, and I think the reason why I felt so attracted to dragonflies, is that in a way they have this almost godly quality, where they are on the one hand really sort of rooted in the essential things of our lives, being rooted in fresh water, which is so essential to all of us, but which is also abundant. So on the one hand, they're everywhere, but on the other hand, they are emerging out of that water in their splendid color, and they're very elevated and supernal almost, and in that sense very godly. And so on the one hand, they sort of share this message with us of how critical a healthy environment and how critical the living world is to us. But on the other hand, they also share this intrinsic value with us, just simply the beauty that insects have. And I think dragonflies are rather unique in that quality. And I often say that if we would love every living being the same way that we can love dragonflies, then it would be a better place to live. Yes, because fresh water obviously is essential to our lives. So that was my talk. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you're interested in my work and if you want to explore the different roles that I have had to take to popularize dragonflies, yeah, then please visit my website and follow the links there. It also has a nice expose of the new species I described. So hopefully you'll enjoy it. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening. I hope I can be available for questions. I was planning to go out tomorrow morning for some bird watching, so I have to see if I can answer any questions on my phone. And otherwise, if not, I apologize, but I hope that you've enjoyed my talk. Thank you very much.